First of all, thank you all for your attendance to our presentation about the maintenance costs of a self-provisioned fiber optic network. My name is Darren Light. I am co-founder, vice president, and owner of Celerity Integrated Services. Celerity designs, builds, services, and maintains fiber optic and wireless infrastructure. With me today, I have a very special guest and co-presenter in Jim Van Dyke from the Upper Adams School District. Jim, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself? You may have to unmute your mic.
You are correct.
Most common phrase of 2020 and 2021.
Yeah. So let me introduce myself. I'm Jim Van Dyke. I'm the Director of Technology and Transportation for Upper Adams School District. I've worked here at Upper Adams for 29 years. The first 8, I was in the classroom as a middle school social studies teacher. Then I earned a master's in educational administration and along the way, a Cisco Networking Academy trainer, and suddenly got offered the Director of Technology position in the district at that time. So thank you for joining us here today. I'll give it back to Darren.
Thank you, Jim. Quick side note, guys, we do have a third silent co-presenter today in Sarah Shiner, Celerity's sales and marketing coordinator. Sarah did a fantastic job of helping us put the slide deck together. And, if I refer to Sarah, you know that I'm not talking to some imaginary friend of mine. And Sarah is also serving a very important purpose in being our scapegoat in the event of any technological difficulties we have today. But welcome to our presentation about the maintenance costs of a self-provisioned network. I'd like to start by just, providing a little bit of the background and impetus for putting this presentation together. Now, I did mention that, Celerity designs and builds fiber optic and wireless infrastructure. And as such, you can probably imagine our customer base is comprised of fiber carriers and wireless carriers. We also do a lot of work for electric utilities. But in our nearly 20-year history, we've had the opportunity to build quite a lot of private networks for schools, universities, healthcare facilities, cities, townships, municipalities, and we've even extended into the private sector, doing some networks for car dealerships, campgrounds, and even a chicken farm, just to name a few of those. Now, while we really appreciate the business from our normal customer base, we truly enjoy working with people that are building these private networks that haven't been through the process before. It's truly professionally rewarding to work through a project with, let's say, a school administrator. They're not supposed to know the steps for building a fiber optic network, and it's a rewarding to be partnered with them, lend our subject matter expertise, and get through a successful project that may seem very daunting at the onset. Now, personally, I've also had the opportunity to speak at several trade shows about some of our success stories and case studies, as well as just the basics of building a fiber optic network. And whenever we talk to our new potential customers or meet some at a trade show, after we get through the steps, after we talk about the process, maybe throw some ballpark financial numbers around those, invariably, the one question that always gets asked, well, what is this going to cost me once I do the build? Like, what can I expect? And invariably, my response is usually, well, it depends, or I don't know. And there are a host of factors that would go into that. And I don't like wishy-washy answers, but I don't have a crystal ball to predict the future. So about 2 years ago now, because of COVID, after doing a presentation at one of the trade shows, I had the idea that, maybe we could do an actual case study on one of these private builds. And no sooner did that thought pop into my mind than Upper Adams School District and Jim Van Dyke popped into my mind as the perfect specimen to analyze. Not only because Jim's a great guy, and I was pretty convinced that I could twist his arm enough to have him co-present with me, but we've got a really good history and sampling size from Jim's network, as well as Jim encountered an out of the blue, completely unexpected maintenance issue that we're going to talk about later. I'm just foreshadowing for that. I do not want to take that away. But, probably important to this story is that while Celerity was involved in the initial build of Upper Adams School District, we actually did that for one of our customers who was a competitive access provider that specialized in helping build some of these private educational networks. Subsequently, about 3 years after that initial build was completed, unfortunately, that company went out of business and kind of turned over the reins of the maintenance to Celerity, and we've been working with Jim very closely ever since. But that'll factor into Jim's story, and a little bit more on that to come. As far as our presentation today, I'm going to go through just kind of the basics of building a self-provision network, the steps. We'll establish some of the ground rules as well as some of the definitions for some terms that we're going to be throwing around in the presentation today. So, we're going to lead off with the steps necessary to design and build a fiber optic network. This will not so much be a 10,000 foot overview as more of a 30,000 foot supersonic flyby. So we can get to the heart of the matter when Jim's going to talk about the background of his build and then a deep dive into his maintenance issues. So we typically break this down into four main stages: the planning, the design, the construction, and the maintenance. One of the questions we're always asked is, how long does this take? For our standard customers, we can do this a build in as little as 6 months. 9 months to 12 months is typically the average. But if you're a school district and you're going for E-rate funding, this could take 2.5 years, depending on when you hit the cycle for that, applying for that funding. We highly recommend that you don't apply for that funding until after the design and permitting stage, and I will get into that in a little bit as to why we suggest that. So, of course, the first question that we are always asked is, how much is this going to cost? And while we could, maybe talk in terms of general construction, we greatly, we strongly suggest that you do a feasibility study. Feasibility studies are nominal in cost. What we do is we send one of our outside plant engineers into the field, have them look at the real world conditions. What is the best route to take? Is there any existing infrastructure that we can use as far as existing conduits, existing pole line? Who owns those poles? How much of the what portions of the network might need to be built underground? What can be aerial? And, we put some distances to it. And the main deliverable that comes out of the feasibility study would be a KMZ map of the routes that we plan to take, because the shortest route isn't always the best. This is actually the chicken farm that I had referred to earlier, where they were trying to get from building A on the left-hand side of the slide out to their hatchery and to their rendering plant. And this was a multi-phase, multi-year project. But in addition to the map, what we provide are some firm, what I will call firm budgetary numbers. So here you can see the chart that shows that we're going to attach to about 30 poles, and we've classified those in terms of make ready, as no make ready, light make ready, medium make ready, and I'll get into the definition of make ready in a moment. But what we're able to do then is apply some of our industry knowledge to the cost of make ready, estimate that make ready for you. Then because we know approximately what we're building, we can put a budgetary number to the construction, and we can put some budgetary numbers to the permitting costs, as well as a firm price on what it would take to design the network. So assuming that we move from feasibility to actual design, this is the longest portion of the project. You'll have to talk to pole owners. You'll have to talk to anyone that owns underground conduit. You might have to get involved with the DOT, some townships, private right-of-ways. Now, it's important to note that if you are going to use existing pole line, you will have to have an attachment agreement in place with that pole owner. Private networks, there could be, 3 or 4 pole owners that you need to have an attachment agreement with each one of those organizations in order to be able to apply to attach to the pole. So we're going to talk about the make-ready process now. This is for aerial construction. When you are building on existing pole line, we break the joint use utility pole down into 3 zones. You have the electric zone at the top in blue, then you have the safety zone, which is represented in pink on this diagram, and then the communication space is below at the bottom of the pole and represented in yellow on this diagram. Now, if you are the last communications attacher to the pole, you have to take that top position. So when we talk about make ready, it's all the work that would be required to happen on that pole to maintain clearances. We need to maintain clearances from not only from the ground level so that cars and vehicles can pass underneath, but we also have to maintain that safe 40 inches between the electric zone and the communication zone. So an example of make ready would be, as I said, you had to be the top attacher. Those 2 communications lines would then move down, and then you could take that position. And that work to move those lines down would be your make ready. So we need to go out, and the process can be slightly different. It could be performed by the pole owner. It could be performed by a contractor such as Celerity, or a pole owner may contract to that out to one of their preferred vendors. But the process is pretty much the same. You're going to go out, you're going to take measurements of all of the attachment heights on the pole, and then you're going to make recommendations for how to move those cables around to accommodate the new construction. Not too bad if the pole line, this is kind of a busy pole, but in real world situations, we come across some highly populated poles that look like this one, and you can imagine it would be pretty hard to design what needs to happen. And it's important to note that make ready work, can be costly if there's a lot of attachers, up to and including a complete replacement of this pole to put in a larger pole so that we can accommodate all of that spacing. So, as I said, the longest portion of the project typically takes about 150 days, though, we're seeing much closer averages to 180 days and even longer. The process would work is that you would submit application to apply for that permission to get on the pole. You would get back an engineering invoice as well as a construction estimate for what the make ready costs will be. You have 15 days to accept and pay those. Moving forward, the pole owner has another 15 days to accept that, and then they have 60 to 75 days to go out and do the physical work. Now, as you can imagine, if there are 6 communication lines in the communication space that all need to lower, the lowest guy's got to go first, followed by the second lowest guy, and that is a huge coordination, across 6 different companies, and really tends to stretch these timelines. Next slide. Fortunately, underground permitting, not quite as bad. We typically get these back in 30 to 60 days. Typical thing that we would have to do would be a PennDOT highway occupancy permit, although township permits sometimes come up. One of the design costs that might be a little bit more than normal would be if you'd had to cross over a railroad, or you're boring underground, under a highway, you might have to do plan and profile drawings or have PE stamped drawings. But coming out of the design phase, the number one thing that you're going to get are construction prints. And those construction prints are the specific scope of work as to what needs to be done to build the network. You can take those prints, go out to contractor A, contractor B, and contractor C for a request for proposal, and get their quotes back and do a true apples to apples comparison of what your costs are going to be. This is why we recommend not going for E-rate funding until you have that cost in your hand. At this point, you'll know your make ready, you'll know your construction, and have a true sense of what your costs are going to be. So really quickly, just going through the construction, we're just sharing some pictures here. Here you see one of our digger derricks. It's a glorified post hole digger with a boom that can then lift that telephone pole and set it in the ground, that we'll see in the next slide. There we are planting the pole after the hole was dug. Next slide shows one of one of the cost factors of aerial construction would be where is the pole line. If we can't get next to it with our bucket trucks, we may have to climb those poles, and that takes a little bit longer. This slide shows a technician drilling a hole for to make an attachment. I want to draw your attention to that silver wire above the technician's hard hat. That is 6.6 M strand. Some people call it messenger, but that is what we physically attach to the poles to provide structural integrity for the fiber. We actually attach the fiber to that messenger. Next slide will show just a little bit more detail on the work that he's doing there. And then once we attach all the messenger, it's a three-step process. We attach the messenger, and then we temporarily roll out the fiber. We call it jigging the fiber. You can see this photo shows the fiber kind of hanging in a temporary roller there. Again, just a little bit closer of a close-up of that picture. And then once we get the fiber jigged out, we'll put a lashing machine on the messenger. It rides on the messenger, and we pull that along, and there's lashing wire that actually spins almost a spider web behind it and affixes the fiber to the messenger. This photo shows it's kind of a two-man operation, a guy up in the bucket making sure that the fiber's not getting damaged or kinked while the guy is pulling that along the ground. And you can see how the fiber's nice and tight to the messenger behind the lashing machine. Underground construction, pretty simple. We're digging trenches in the ground. We're throwing the conduits in the ground and then pulling the fiber optic cable through them. Different methodologies for underground construction. This is a cable plow. It kind of digs its own trench and places the cable in the ground all in one fell swoop. These are mostly for drops and things like that. Because we can't achieve great depth in the northeast here with the cable plow. Another methodology would be directional drilling. We are horizontally drilling under the ground, pulling some interduct back through that drill hole and then placing the cable through that conduit. The benefit of directional drilling is there's very little disturbance to the surface, not a lot of restoration cost, but this is generally more expensive of a way to build underground network. So the costs, need to be evaluated. Open excavation, just what it sounds like. You see we're digging the trench that we will eventually put the conduits in. Next slide shows another. This is a chain excavator. A little bit less than open excavation, but still a lot of restoration to do. And we're digging these trenches. You can see the conduits on the right-hand side there. Once the trench is placed, we'll put those 4-inch conduits in the ground. We'll pull 3 1/4 through this to provide for future. One of those 3 1/4 would have the initial cable build in it, and then 2 more pathways for future growth. We don't always have to use 4-inch conduit. We can directly bury that HDPE triplex, and there you see a little bit about what I'm talking about. So you can see the 3 multicolored ducts that we're placing in the ground, and then we would use 1 for the cable installation and 2 more for future. Biggest obstacle for underground construction is rock. Some contingencies should be put in your construction numbers for encountering rock. In this photo, you see we had to jackhammer out some rock in order to achieve depth. We typically put underground construction at about 36 inches. And a lot of times we've got to excavate the rock out to get that depth, and that isn't always predictable. Once the conduit systems are run, we put vaults in place so that we can access the underground infrastructure. Vaults can either be manholes or handholes. In this case, we're just showing you a handhole. We store slack coils in there. We store splice cases in there and just use them as a means to access the conduits under the ground. Once all the conduits and vaults are in place, then we'll pull in the cable. Important to note that we don't just pull that off the cable reel. We actually pull it off the reel and put it on the ground in a figure 8. And then when we pull that through the conduit, we can alleviate any twists or stresses on the cable to make sure that it's not damaged in installation. Real quickly going through the splicing and testing, we've got the technician who's breaking into the sheath, exposing the buffer tubes that then get dressed into the splice case. we're pulling the buffer tubes off and exposing the bare fibers to be stowed into a splice tray. Once those are stowed into the splice tray, then we can move forward with the fusion splicing process. And you can see there that it becomes very tedious, particularly when you're dealing with high count cable. Once all the fusion splices are made, they're protected with a heat shrink sleeve stowed back into the splice tray. We stow the splice trays and the buffer tube storage back into the case, and either put that case in the air on the strand or in the vault. Quick note about fiber termination panels. These are the inside locations where you would have access to the fiber ends with your equipment. You can see a typical communications rack inside the building here, and then the inside of a fiber termination panel. There would be a splice tray underneath that protective cover there, and the process is the same. We're fusion splicing pre-connectorized pigtails, which would get onto the fiber ends, which would give you access to the termination. So that was our 30,000 foot flyby. And now I'll turn it over to Jim, and Jim's going to tell you the story about his build and do a deep dive into his maintenance costs. Jim?
Okay, thank you, Darren. Well, let me give you a little background before we get started. When I came into my current position in 2000, our district had been leasing a fiber network from the local phone company. And being a small rural district and being able to connect our remote buildings was a huge deal for us. It was the beginning of the big push to get students internet access, at least for us. If you remember those gumdrop iMacs from around 2000, those were the days. And if you've seen the new iMacs, what's old is new again. But anyway, the cost was not exorbitant to lease that fiber network. And we kept renewing in 5-year increments. We initially started with a 10 meg connection when I came on board, and we worked our way up to a 1 gig unmanaged leased fiber network. Then in 2000, that cozy relationship we had with our fiber lease company went very south. We went from looking at $1,500 a month or an $18,000 a year budget expense for our lease fiber, which we considered that a manageable number, to a much higher leased fiber network cost of $14,000 a month or $168,000 a year. That's a considerable change. It would have massively impacted our budget. I know my technology budget wasn't that great in 2000, and 168,000 would have just sunk us. So fortunately, I had a superintendent at the time that listened when I had this wild idea that we could build our own fiber network. Thank you, Dr. Eschbach, wherever you are right now, and a school board that recognized that we needed to focus some of our capital budget to building this. Lastly, we had time. We had a year to prep and get ready, do the research, the bidding process, and then plan on spreading the spending costs over 2 budget cycles. So let's get to the nitty-gritty. The specifics about our particular build: we have 3 remote elementary schools. We've since closed one of them since the beginning of it, but we still own the property. Our district office, high school and middle school campus are the head end for all the distribution in this network. It's distributed out to each building on multiple gig connections. We have multiple strands of fiber lit up. And if anybody's interested, that comes back to a Cisco 6509. That's our core. The fiber itself consists of 9 miles that connect all these buildings. So let's get back to the build. When we began this process in 2011, we narrowed our bids down to 3 providers, 2 local to us, and that would be South Central PA, the York-Harrisburg area, and 1 from outside that region. In the end, we did not award the contract based on cost alone. We took into consideration the completeness of all the bids. Some bids were very light on specifics, just providing a cost, but the winning bid was more detailed. It provided engineering expenses, attachment costs, permitting fees, flagger services, man hours for walking the route, getting pole numbers from every pole, property ownership in case we needed to plant a pole or a guy wire, and who we needed to notify. since we're a small rural district, good relationships with our neighbors is crucial. So if we needed to plant a pole or a guy wire in somebody's yard, we wanted to get to them before people showed up and were making a mess in their yard. The last thing is make ready expenses, and make ready can really cost you. As we found out, for instance, a pole replacement. If your entity happens to be the last connection on a pole and it's an old 35-foot pole, with today's poles being 40 to 60 feet high, guess who gets the honor of replacing that entire pole? Not MedEd or the CenturyLink company that you're leasing some space from. You get that honor. And that's part of the process. So at the outset, at the very beginning of our bidding, we were looking at close to 100 poles needing replaced. Darren, how much does a pole cost today?
Well, in bulk like that, Jim, they'd probably be, $2,000-$3,000 a piece, but it's not uncommon to see a $10,000 pole replacement.
Thank you. Luckily, we didn't have any $10,000 poles, but I know that we had in the 1,500 to 2,000 range. And fortunately, we got that 100 poles down to about 25 to 30 through some engineering design changes. We did an underground bore to avoid some poles. And this actually reduced the final projected cost of the build, which brings me to another example of our project. There was a section of several poles that were crowded, too short, and at an intersection of two state roads in our borough that were going to need replaced. It was a huge mess. Celerity changed the design, bored underground from one pole through the intersection, and then brought the fiber back up above ground a few hundred feet up the street. That saved us from the additional expenses of replacing poles, all the man hours directing traffic as that's going on. So it may have been a little bit more expensive up front, but in the end, it was a huge cost saver and allowed us to avoid a major headache with our design and build. So that's some of the interesting things during our build. Some other important things to note: the construction began in the spring of 2012, and it was early spring, and it was concluded in the summer of 2012. We were off our leased fiber network. We were lighting up our own network, and life was good. I thought with the expected lifespan of 30 years, and in 2012, it'll be 2042 by the time I have to worry about any of this, and I will be retired before that point. So I was thinking, this one's in the bag, I'm done. And was I wrong? Remember when I said that we use MedEd and CenturyLink poles? Well, CenturyLink won't let just anybody attach to their poles. The company that originally guided us through this was holding our attachment rights, and they went out of business. So we did not want to go to the trouble of becoming certified to CenturyLink's standards to get attachments. And because of that, CenturyLink demanded that we remove our attachments. So back to Celerity we went to come up with a solution, and a relocation project began around 2015. We had to detach from about 40 different poles spread out through 3 separate areas along our original route. Some of the highlights or lowlights from that project involved speaking with property owners about placing poles and or underground trenching, boring on private property. And you can see from this map, it's a tax plat map along part of our route. Celerity went and identified every single potential property owner that we would have to contact about potential pole placements or underground boring. And we did have a big meeting at our district offices, invited all the people down so we could speak to them. And then those that didn't show up, we went out and met with them in person as we were able to. The ones that we had to go out to, those were some interesting experiences. I'll relay a couple here. First, there was a staking project where we were working on a proposed route. One gentleman that lived right next to a school in Orangeville took all the stakes out of his yard, threw them into the school district's property. And when I went to speak to him, I'm not going to say it on camera, but he said I could F off. I'm not going to get to put anything on his property. Another woman made me leave information on a picnic table. She wouldn't let me come near the house. She was going to call the police. And in the end, not a shocker, she wouldn't let us have access to her property. Those caused some minor incidents, those caused some minor reconfigurations, but nothing that we couldn't overcome. On the positive side, almost everybody that we spoke to understood the situation the district was in when we shared with them how we were being treated, having to vacate the poles, and we needed their assistance. They were very willing, for the most part, to help. Now, how we worked that, each property owner that agreed accepted the $1 nominal fee for right-of-way access. We recorded all of these onto their deeds in the county courthouse, and anywhere we have fiber on private poles, we have access rights, deeded access rights into the property in case of maintenance needs. And we also encountered, a few blips. One person, I wouldn't call it a blip. He was very generous. You can see along the Carlisle Road there in Manette, where it says Manalapan Township, that's a few thousand feet of underground trenching, boring that we were allowed to do to avoid having to attach the poles. And that was at first a hard sell for that gentleman. He said no. He was a school board member from a neighboring district, but once he sat down and spoke with me, he saw the need for the district and relented, which we were very appreciative of. And just as an example of how crucial the fiber is out to these buildings, because you might say, well, why not just set a private network up back to your building? Another fruit farm along this route initially said no because they wanted to have access to internet. Even though they live along a major north-south route, PA State Route 34, they could not get decent internet access to run their business. Fortunately, the superintendent went out and spoke with that individual and was able to get him to understand we couldn't resell internet to him. We just needed to have access. And he relented. Some other obstacles we had to overcome. There's a small stream you can see here on the Carlisle Road section. And the farmer that owned this, you can kind of tell from the picture, it's a fall picture, but it gets a little swampy in there, and they were concerned about equipment getting in and getting stuck. Celerity did an awesome job. They were in and out, no marks. So he was very happy with that. Relocation was done during a portion of the school year. And in the cutover process, I would say we were down really minimally. So overall, the relocation, I would say, went excellent. So now let's talk about some real maintenance issues that have occurred. First one that comes to mind, you can see these pictures, Bendersville section of our fiber. If you remember Superstorm Sandy, that was some of the remnants that it left behind for us. You can see the pole leaning in the picture on the right. If you look at the picture on the left, those poles actually snapped. And when I came upon this scene, I'm the one that took these pictures. I was very concerned our fiber network was going to be down. We were looking at some major expenses. And lo and behold, the fiber never went out. It stayed intact. We maintained connection with that building through the entire process. MedEd came out, reset poles, and Celerity came and completed our reattachments, and we never lost access. So that meant that our security system never went down. Our HVAC monitoring controls never went offline. We're also a designated by the Red Cross as a shelter center. If we would have needed to spool up a location for them, we would have been able to give them internet access, phone access, whatever they needed. So this fiber network has been a benefit, not just for the district, but for the community as well. Also in 2012, 2013, some of you may have seen the state doing what they call their rapid bridge replacement, the RBR. And we encountered one of those in our borough of Orangeville. So we had to do a temporary attachment during the construction process, and then when it was complete, do a permanent attachment. And again, Celerity came out, did those attachments for us, and kept us running with no impact whatsoever. Another incident we had, this doesn't happen a lot, but we had a tree fall on a section along the Carlisle Pike. Funny story, the landowner that the tree fell from was a teacher here at the district, and I promised her I was going to give her the bill. She got a little nervous at first, but all kidding aside, Celerity was out, took care of the tree, reattached it, and we never, again, in this instance, lost our connection on the network. Along this 9-10 year ownership of our fiber, MedEd has occasionally replaced a few poles. And when that occurs, we get a letter in the mail from them saying the pole number that's going to be replaced. I contact Celerity and say, hey, this pole is going to be replaced. Here's the date that they're looking at this. Can you please have a crew out there to do our reattachment? And Celerity always takes care of those. It happens. It's nice that MedEd will take care of those things. And here's an instance of one in the borough of Lawrenceville that we received a letter in the mail from MedEd saying this particular pole was going to be replaced. Gave the info and the specifics to Celerity, and they take care of all the planning, and I just get to say the network stays up and running the entire time. The last most interesting one, recently our Lawrenceville building went through a remodel and addition project. And as part of that, they did some demolition work on the interior of the building. And as you can see from the picture on the left, they took their job very seriously, and they demolished literally everything inside, including the fiber that was run up through one of the walls, and took out all the phones along the way as well, our old copper phones. So I contacted Celerity. They came out, ran a new piece of fiber, did the fusion, and had us back up and running within a day. Now, unfortunately, we did not get charged. We paid the bill, but we were reimbursed by the construction company for their error. So that's pretty much it for 10 years of service. Now, Darren will share some of the other routine maintenance that occurs on some networks that we have not experienced.
Yeah, this is the portion, guys, where I wish I had a crystal ball, but looking back in history, some of the things that we've seen include squirrel chews, bullet holes. Picture on the right there shows some damage. The squirrels just absolutely love to chew on this stuff, and when they get through the sheath, through the Kevlar, they can break a couple fibers. The picture on the left, that's a bullet hole. You would think we would see those more out in the country, but we do. You can tell by the building in the background, we do see quite a few of those. Typically after holidays, where I guess people are shooting their guns in celebration. Next slide will show, this was an emergency that we rolled up on. In this instance, a dump truck had gone down the road, had not lowered his dump. He caught the fiber, pulled it down for several spans, and when we got out there, the police had just, pretty much coiled it up and threw it on the side of the road. So, I mean, you're going to have some of these issues that come up. We can't predict how many you'll see, but, you can tell from Jim's presentation that, he hasn't had a whole lot of them other than that one that came out of left field.
And I could add here before we get to the summary, my biggest concern through ownership was that DUI at 2 o'clock in the morning, someone goes off the road and strikes a pole and knocks everything out. And in the entire time that we have owned our fiber network, that has never occurred. That was my biggest fear at the start of this. And since that time, it's gone to the back of my head. It's just not something that has happened in that entire time. So let's do a little summary here. If you remember at the beginning when I started, we were looking at $168,000 a year for our leased fiber network. So 10 years down the road, that would have been $1.68 million. If you look at the private build costs, our initial build, the pole attachments, the maintenance agreements, the relocation project that we really didn't want to have to do, the repairs, and the routine maintenance over that 10-year period, $644,000. So Darren actually did the calculations for this, but when I saw this, I'm like, I'm going to steal this and take this to my school board so they can see that investment that they made 10 years ago was worth it.
We're expecting for Jim to get a big raise out of that and hopefully share a portion of that with me in a finder's fee. But you know, as I said at the top of this was wow. I mean, you can see why Upper Adams is the perfect example, Jim. If you wouldn't have had that unforeseen circumstance, you know, you would have been, you know, $100,000 better on the left hand side of that column. And you know, it's important to note, Jim did mention that the Arnsville repair, he ultimately didn't pay for that, but we did include it in these costs here. So Jim, was it worth it?
It was very much worth it. That's affirmative from a cost perspective and also from a usability and utility for our district.
Well, and I appreciate you doing this for me today. And I think the fact-finding mission of, you know, for me moving forward with potential customers, as well as, you know, at trade shows, having this kind of information in our back pocket to present as factual will be very valuable moving forward. So thanks for your time today. With that, guys, we've gotten through the presentation. We have ample time for questions. So we would go ahead and we appreciate you taking the time. Hopefully, you know, everybody is still awake. We can't see you all. But what questions you guys have for the group?
Yeah, I have a question for Jim. So what kind of response did you get from either Sprint United Telephone / CenturyLink about that price increase? Like, that just seems totally outrageous. Did they give you a reason for why they were jacking up the price?
Yeah, actually they did. Previous the lease fiber that I came into when I came into the position was completely unmanaged. We basically had dark fiber at both ends. They provided some electronics to get us from fiber to copper, but we did not pass through the local telephone office. The change was going to be, it was going to be more managed. We were going to run through their central office in our borough of Biglerville here, and they were going to have more control, but they promised us much more reliable, and they called it their enterprise grade Ethernet, which, yeah, it was crazy numbers, but that was their justification for it.
And then I guess I'm also curious about later when CenturyLink basically kicked you off their poles. Is that payback for building your own network, or what's that all about?
Well, I can't, I think, ascribe a motive, but I suspected that. But there were rules in place at the time that you needed to be, I think the term was an ILEC, which I don't remember what those initials stand for, but you had to have a certification to be attached to their poles. And since we weren't a utility provider and we weren't willing to go through the steps to become a certified utility provider, they exercised their right to kick us off the poles.
You couldn't use eminent domain as a argument, I guess, if you got the solicitors involved in it.
Well, I thought that exact same thing, but I think eminent domain on 40 poles, the lawyer fees alone to have like rights at each one, and then you find out it's surprising how much power utility companies have in the state of Pennsylvania, and it was not worth the fight.
Yeah, we're actually doing another project for another school district. And, you know, CenturyLink is, you know, currently now called Lumen. They have a very hard line stance on who they will allow to attach to their poles. So much to the point where we build our network on this project. This just happened 2 weeks ago. The construction prints showed not to attach to a CenturyLink pole to kind of pass it by, but when the crews were out there, they thought attaching to it would give a little bit better clearance over a driveway. So they made that attachment, and the school district summarily received a letter from CenturyLink saying to cease and desist attaching to our poles. Very hardline stance. It's very geographically based for that company. We run it, you know, usually if it's for a school district, it usually goes through pretty easy because, you know, it's the benefit of the community and the school and the children. But there are certain instances where they just say no, and that's where we have to design underground.
Do they allow the cable companies, though, to attach to their poles, right?
But they're
regulated by the local municipality franchise agreements. So could there have been a way to go through franchising with the township or the municipality to kind of force the hand on that, or?
I don't remember specifically. I remember the conversations about eminent domain and lawyers' fees and how long we had to get this all completed. And our calculation was that with Celerity giving us some advisement on the side, that coming up with a solution that we got off their polls was the fastest and most expedient and the least expensive option for us.
I'd like to work with the township and have them increase the poll fees for them to kind of push their, maybe instead of attacking them with lawyers, work with the municipality to get them to increase the rates on the polls.
I'm sure the incumbents lawyers are better paid, and there are a lot
You're
more of
right.
those than the school district lawyers.
You're right. They have floors of lawyers. We have one.
So I have a question for Darren. I've managed school networks for a long time, and to me, dark fiber in any flavor, any way you can get it, is really a no-brainer for any school. I mean, it's just like, if you have that opportunity, take it. But I recently heard of a school that was like, you know what, this dark fiber project, I like being able to call my carrier, and I just have a piece of equipment that I plug into for my network, and I don't have to worry about anything else. I'm just curious if you've had customers that have kind of shied away from dark fiber, either self-provisioned or leased dark fiber, where they don't have to worry about the maintenance cost, but just that somehow dark fiber is more complicated than plugging into a carrier provided handoff.
Sure, and I think that really depends on where you are and how much the service costs. Obviously, if you're in Southeast Pennsylvania or Southwest Pennsylvania and you have some competition, the construction costs may not outweigh what the leasing costs are or the managed service cost is, because it's just that much cheaper because there's competition. In the case for Jim, there was only one game in town, and that is the case for a lot of rural areas within Pennsylvania. So it's dark fiber private network isn't for everyone, but it's certainly, a viable option for some folks that don't have options. Did that answer your question, Roy?
Yeah, I'm kind of more curious about whether there are tech staff at schools that just say, hey, dark fiber in any flavor, dark fiber is just more complicated in some way than a lit service, either because there's maybe a real or perceived notion that it's somehow more difficult to manage a dark fiber network.
Oh, okay. Well, Jim, I mean, that might be more of a question for Jim. How much do you need to deal with that? Because I mean, once the fiber's in the air, other than a couple maintenance issues, once the equipment's plugged in, we've done this for a lot of school districts, and we're, a lot of times we take phone calls and just say, hey, where fiber isn't working between here and there, what do we do? And we can run them through some troubleshooting before we roll trucks. And, a lot of times it's, oh yeah, we did some work. We swapped the connections, and, we swap them back and it works again. So once it's in the air, there's really not a lot to take care of. And once it's operating, there's not a lot to take care of. It would have to be, how familiar you are with that network equipment that's on it would be where some of that would come into, whether or not your technicians feel comfortable with that or not. Jim, do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, from my perspective, it's really been like turnkey. I mean, once the fiber was on the poles and we got the word that we could light it up, it's been running continually, even through some of those pictures that you've seen. I've had no trouble. Like, we're Cisco from end to end. The gear's reliable. It shoots a strong beam, and like it's basically plug and play. So that's never been a concern or like a fear factor to have gotten into this. And the one thing that I would share, I guess, is owning the fiber and not being dependent on a provider to provision me a network and network speed. I can hang any like electronics I want on the network. So we're currently at a gig with multiple connections. We're going to go to 10 gig connections, in 2 to 3 years. And we could go to 100 gig and I'm not reliant and dependent on a provider. Like I can do what I want with my network. So I think that freedom for me was another reason to go with a private fiber network.
Okay, we have a question from Greg on the chat. What is the SLA time for repairs? So just, and then there's a follow-up to this. But typically speaking, Celerity offers 4-hour on-site response time for any necessary repairs. We found that, through our nearly 20 years of doing this, that in the middle of the night, it takes about an hour for our technician to get into the shop, get his truck, get his things that he needs. And then so long as it's within a 3-hour drive from here, we can get there within that 4 hours. Sometimes we'll do SLAs where it's next business day if the network doesn't feel it's that critical. And, any point in between that to, because if we are rolling trucks in the middle of the night, typically there are overtime expenses associated with that, premium service. And a lot of networks will just say, no, come out in the next day and we'll take care of it under normal rates. The follow-up part to that would be how much have the costs increased for a new build at this time compared to the cost 10 years ago? That's a really tough question because some of the costs have gone down and some of the costs have gone up. Our biggest problem in the industry right now is too little resources in the human resource. Trucks and equipment we can get, technicians and necessarily skilled technicians are really hard to come by. I would say the costs, fiber optic cable is running pretty much the same as it was 10 years ago in terms of the material cost. We're seeing an escalation in those make-ready costs. Those are the thing that's grown dramatically, probably to the factor of 20-25% at least in those make-ready costs because their poles are just getting busier. Hopefully, Greg, that answers your question. I got it perfect. Thank you very much. So that one's good. Any other questions?
So Darren, has the FCC policy around one-touch make-ready, has that actually helped you guys? Has that been beneficial?
Well, yes and no. We are listed as a one-touch make-ready for provider for groups like PPL. Really, they don't want you to wield that hammer until the timelines have been exhausted. We're seeing that some folks are taking liberties with that, which is creating some tension amongst the pole owners and the attachers, and then that creates just more resistance the next time. So some of these folks are coming through and they're saying, "Oh, one touch make ready, we're going to be doing all of this." We've found that it's still a lot better if we're building on for the benefit of one of our customers, that we individually reach out to everyone else that's attached to that pole and say, "Hey, do you mind if we move these cables down while we're out there doing the build? We can get a jump on getting this network built." So one touch is there. It's just not smooth in its operation yet. We got another question on the chat. How about wireless connections on towers? Bandwidth cheaper than dark fiber. What is enough? What is enough bandwidth is pretty much going to depend on your needs if you're a school or if you're a private entity. Wireless connections are an option. A lot of times, though, it's just a little bit difficult to gain access to those towers, and the cost for attaching to those towers can be, get pretty pricey because that's going to be a recurring cost as well. Always an option.
Yeah, more about, I guess my question is more about extending the school network out to the students, especially in these times where we've had, virtual connections. And obviously, you're not going to run fiber to every house, but, the potential of building a I don't know if Wi-Fi is the answer though, a Wi-Fi network versus a cellular network to reach kids.
Well, this is, I think, where, you know, everybody's bombarded with the 5G, right? 5G is here. The biggest misconception about a wireless network is the amount of wires that are actually in a wireless network. 5G is going to be fast. 5G is going to be, you know, deployed, as they say, you know, nationwide. T-Mobile's advertising it, Verizon's advertising it, and it's nationwide, but it's probably mostly in the here again in the metropolitan areas. 5G, it's going to be, you know, low latency, high bandwidth, but it's going to require antennas everywhere, and each one of those antennas is going to need a fiber optic connection. So, you know, there's a lot of wires in a wireless system, and, you know, if you want to truly deploy a network, you could certainly do that and, you know, create a wireless mesh, and it's much cheaper than building to every house, but there's still going to be a lot of fiber infrastructure that goes into that. Okay, any more questions? We have a few minutes here, and I'll note that immediately following this, Celerity has some virtual booth time scheduled. So if anybody wants to come over and visit us in our booth, we will be there. I think it's immediately following this meeting. I'm getting a yes from my technical assistant.
So Don, on your bandwidth question, so IU13 built a dark fiber network, and we justified it on the basis that our school districts were going to need more than a gig really soon, and looking at going to higher speed carrier lit services became extremely expensive. So I don't know, there's a threshold in there somewhere where you break even doing dark fiber or get ahead doing dark fiber. So we put up 100 gig backbone, and we're doing 10 gig handoffs. To do that on lit services from, you know, Comcast or similar local incumbent would be extremely expensive. So in our case, I would say, yeah, we get more bandwidth for our money by doing it on dark fiber, and we get the flexibility to you know, put whatever optics we want on it and turn it up to whatever speed we want.
Yeah, that's what we're doing here as well. We've had an agreement with Comcast for over 20 years for dark fiber, and we just put new GBICs on the ends and get, you know, when we need the increased bandwidth between the buildings. But maintenance over long term becomes an issue as well. But cool.
Good stuff. Well, we're just about out of time here. Anybody want to squeeze in one last question? All right, well then, all right, one more for Jim. Jim, any future plans for your network?
Well, like I mentioned earlier, we are looking in the next 2 to 3 years to upgrade the electronics from 1 gig to a 10 gig connection. And we also continue to actively look for people that would like to lease our dark fiber. With the 12 strands, we're not using it all. So, and I know that space on the poles isn't that great. And we have some prime real estate that I think at some point we will be able to get some income back from what we have.
Excellent. Well, thanks again, everyone. Greatly appreciate it, and hope everybody has a great day. Stay dry.
Thank you.
Everyone.
It
Thank
does.
you.
Yep. Thank you, guys.